This video is brought to you by DC20, the wonderfully innovative new TTRPG system whose Kickstarter is live now and is absolutely crushing through its goals. DC20 is an evolution in fantasy TTRPGs. It brings rules that are fun and intuitive while still being fresh and familiar, with gameplay that's designed to be smooth while also being full of dynamic choices that keep players engaged and encourages teamwork. DC20's rules allow for open-ended creativity that doesn't get in the way of your story or incredibly customizable character creation. Combat is flexible and engaging and rewards your high rolls. Yes, they actually matter. All DC20 backers will get free beta access immediately when the Kickstarter ends, a free monster starter pack, a free PDF with hardcover, and the lowest price for the game that you're really gonna see. So what are you waiting for? Go back DC20 on Kickstarter now using my link in the description and the pinned comment below. A few weeks ago, I put out a video called DC20 Everything You Need to Know, but as many commenters pointed out, there was still a lot that they needed to know. So today, we're going to cover most of those things, and we aren't going to be wasting any time. I spent the majority of the previous video discussing many in-combat abilities and effects, but we never actually talked about how to start combat or what the rules for initiative look like. Spoilers, this is probably my least favorite rule in DC20 at the moment, but we'll get to why in a second. Initiative in DC20 doesn't work the same way that it does in Dungeons & Dragons. In D&D, when initiative is called for, everyone, including enemies, roll a d20 and add their initiative score, which is essentially just their dexterity modifier, unless they have some other specific bonuses to add. What this ultimately means is that characters that have high dexterity or that are able to make the check with advantage will often fairly consistently end up at the top of the order and are able to go first. Of course though, bad rolls happen, but this is often the case. In DC20 though, things work a bit differently. You do not have a static initiative modifier. Instead, when a roll for it is called, you roll a check based on what you were doing at the time. The text uses the example of one character trying to communicate with a group of bandits, while another party member tries to sneak around them. In that scenario, if initiative is called for, the character talking might make an influence check as their initiative roll, while the player sneaking around would make a stealth roll instead. I want to say that conceptually, I think this is super cool, and I am aware that it's not entirely unique to DC20. I understand the general concept was borrowed from Pathfinder, but has been expanded on here. My quest continues to reach 10,000 subs by the time that the 2024 PHB comes out in September, so if you like what I do, a sub to the channel would really mean a lot. Anyway, like I said, I love the idea behind how this works. Basing your initiative score off of what you're actually doing when combat broke out feels like it intuitively makes sense. Your rogue sneaking around might not have been the one that actually triggered combat, and they're likely to have a high score in stealth, meaning that they will probably go toward the beginning of the round, but not necessarily, as we'll discuss shortly. There's two main issues I see here. First, it creates some degree of min-maxable agency, which feels a bit out of place. I get the feeling that anytime the players sense that combat is about to break out, that they'll just immediately start doing whatever it is that their character is best at, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to be doing that thing. Like, it's broad daylight and you're in an open field, and the rogue is totally going to be sneaking around just so they can roll stealth for initiative. And as anyone who watches my channel knows, I'm not even close to an optimizer or a min-maxer or anything like that, and even I thought of doing this within just a few seconds. As a result, it feels very easily exploitable. The second issue I see is just that it feels slow. It even specifically says in the text that the GM will go around to each PC and either approve or assist them in determining their initiative check. Once everyone's initiative checks have been agreed upon, the group will roll for initiative together. So because what you're rolling always has the potential to be very different, assuming you aren't always trying to cheese it at least, it requires some confirmation from the GM that what you want to roll is what you are allowed to roll. This just feels slow and cumbersome. I have to imagine that as players become more experienced that this will become a quicker process, but I can certainly see it being a stumbling block. Okay, so now that we figured out how rolling for initiative actually works, how does our placement in the order function? Well, it's not exactly as straightforward as you might think. Firstly, every encounter will have something known as an encounter DC. This is essentially just the difficulty of whatever the party was trying to do to successfully complete that challenge. Say they were trying to pick a lock quickly, the encounter DC might be set at 15, as that represents the difficulty for picking that lock. Once that's been determined, the GM will then need to set an initiative DC. Typically, this will be set at 5 above the encounter DC, but that's entirely up to the GM's discretion. It can be higher or lower or even the same. Then each player will roll for initiative in the manner that I described earlier. If any player successfully beats the initiative DC with their roll, then the player team goes first. If they don't, then the enemy team goes first. Once it's been decided which team is going first, play will go back and forth from the player team to the enemy team, with each side going down the order of the initiative rolls. However, the GM decides the order that each of the enemies will go. Once the first round has been completed, the order is then locked in. I get what the goal is here. They don't want to end up in a situation where one side goes entirely before the other side, resulting in the battle potentially being over before, say, the enemies even get a chance to do anything. This is an admirable goal, and I understand why it's important. But I will say my preference is just not to do that. I kind of like the more choppy orders that can arise from the system in 5e. Sometimes that might mean that the enemies get steamrolled, or other times it might put the players on the back foot before they can do anything. I am okay with that kind of swinginess. I can understand why others might not be and would prefer a system more akin to this, but I'll be honest, on this one, I'm not sold yet. I feel like initiative in DC20, right now at least, just has too many moving parts. From everyone's check being determined differently, to needing to validate that, to min-maxing the check, to the encounter DC and the subsequent initiative DC, to the strange ordering because it's not purely sequential, it's a system that serves what it is trying to do very well. I'm just not that confident that it needs to do it. At the very least, I would be open to seeing some more variant rules for it included in the published text. The next few things are kind of all clumped together, but they all serve the same underlying purpose, which is to ensure that martial characters feel both powerful and relevant. Let's talk about stamina, maneuvers, techniques, and weapon styles. We'll start off with maneuvers since they're kind of the baseline for everything. You're probably familiar with Battlemaster's maneuvers as they exist in 5e. Well, these are basically that, but for everyone. Maneuvers are really straightforward feats of strength that you would most likely expect that your martial character would be able to do. There are 4 different categories of maneuvers: attack, grapple, defense, and weapon. You can spend an action point on your turn to add the effect of a maneuver to your attack. So, for example, you spend 1 action point to make an attack, you can then spend an additional action point to make it a power attack, which deals +1 damage. Or you can spend 1 action point to make an extended attack, and extend the reach of your weapon by 1 space. Or you could actually even stack them together and spend multiple action points to empower your attacks with multiple different effects simultaneously. Or, provided the maneuver doesn't explicitly prohibit this, you can even use the same one multiple times. For example, you could spend 3 action points if you really wanted to on a power attack and guarantee +3 damage on your hit. You can also use maneuvers to impose certain status effects on targets, like hamstring, which for the cost of 1 action point imposes the slowed condition on the target, essentially halving their movement speed until the end of your next turn. But you can also do things like knock them back or trip them. There are also some pretty cool ones like body block, which is classified as a grapple maneuver. This one allows you to spend 2 action points as a reaction when you're targeted by an attack, and instead hold the creature that you're grappling in the way of the attack, but you both suffer half of the damage. This is honestly so cool and really just does seem like something you would be logically able to do, and now there's a mechanism for it. Even cooler than all these though are the weapon maneuvers. These all work together to not only empower the martial character in a more meaningful way, but they also help to differentiate the selection of weapons so that you have a legitimate reason to pick one over another, which is cool to see. Having a deep but not complex equipment system is something that I've been after for quite a while. Let's take the axe for example. An axe allows you to spend 1 action point to deal +1 damage to the target and force them to make a save against bleeding, which is a status condition that makes them take 1 true damage at the start of their turn. True damage is a type of damage that cannot be mitigated in any way. So this is representing a deep wound that the axe gouges in and the target is unable to recover from in the midst of battle, and are instead constantly taking passive damage from it. However, the axe also has a passive style which allows you to deal +1 damage against creatures that are bloodied, which are under 50% health, or under the effect of the bleeding condition. This is such a cool effect since they work so well in tandem. Causing a creature to bleed will then get them closer to having the bloodied condition, but it allows you to also deal extra damage to them, also getting them closer to that 50% threshold. I love this system for weapon maneuvers and styles, as it really leans into the feeling that they are unique and powerful and actually all have different effects during battle and aren't just simple reskins that use different size damage dice. Now, the question that you might be asking, and it's one that I asked too, is this really seems like a lot of stuff. How am I possibly supposed to keep track of this? And largely, I agree. It is a lot of stuff and can be tricky to keep track of, but it's not nearly as bad as it looks. Firstly, your character doesn't necessarily know how to do every single one of these things. They will know a certain subset of maneuvers and will then be able to learn more as they progress throughout the levels. What this means is that you get time to learn a smaller set of additional abilities before you need to look at and learn more. For example, a first level fighter will know all attack and weapon maneuvers, and then can pick 4 other ones that they want to know from the remaining pool of defense and grapple ones. This is cool because not only does it limit the available pool, but it also allows you to further pick the type of fighter that you want to be with the types of maneuvers that you opt to learn. Secondly, like I mentioned earlier, the maneuvers are just things that kind of feel obvious. Can I trip the target? Can I push them back? Can I swing and hit multiple close enemies? Can I parry with my weapon? The answer to all of these things is yes, provided of course that you do in fact know the maneuver. What I'm getting at is that they aren't all that hard to remember because they're just things that you would intuitively expect your character to be able to do anyway. And for weapon style passives, most people don't change the type of weapon that they're using that often. You more than likely will have a select few that you'll use throughout your adventure, and if you wanted to get something new, it's probably because you were after the passive or the maneuver, which means that you probably already know what it does. Now, none of this is to say that it isn't a lot or to know, or that it doesn't increase the barrier to entry to at least some degree. It does. But I would say that maneuvers and weapon styles are at least executed in a way that feels intuitive and simple. Techniques, though, are where things get a little bit more complicated. You can think of techniques as powered up versions of maneuvers, or kind of like the martial equivalent of spells. They're a bit more complex in the way that they work, but can provide a lot of extra power and creativity for players. Before we explain techniques, it's important to remember that you won't be getting a lot of them. First level fighters start with 0 and only go up to a maximum of 5 by the time that they reach 10th level. So while they might seem like a lot to remember, you have very limited access to them, and they aren't really all that more complicated than spells either. Alright, so let's use an example, Heroic Bash. This technique allows you to spend 1 action point and 1 stamina point to send an enemy hurling through the air. You make an attack as normal against a creature within 1 space, but now you force them to make a physical save. If the attack hits, they take your normal damage, and if they fail the save, they also get pushed 3 spaces horizontally with an additional +1 space for each 5 that they fail to save by. You can also instead choose to send them airborne so they go vertically at half the distance, but then they can be subjected to fall damage. Or you can opt to knock them prone. Doing this causes them to not only move back 1 space, but also sends them prone. Slight aside, this feels like the best option most of the time. Now, that's not everything. Just like how I mentioned in the spell section that you can enhance them by spending additional mana points, the same is true here, except that you can empower your techniques by using stamina points. You can spend additional stamina to increase how far the target is pushed, or to deal extra damage, or more epically, to apply the effects to all the creatures that are within 1 space of you, though that requires an additional action and stamina point. We'll talk about stamina a bit more in a second though. Techniques are a very interesting way at truly selling the power fantasy of a given class or character. They let you perform almost supernatural-like abilities, but those that are still informed by reality. There's no magic involved here. My biggest concern when reading them was, as mentioned earlier, just how long and complex many of them are. But again, given that you only actually know so few at any given time, I don't find that they're overwhelming to manage and deal with. Just for added clarity, stamina points are essentially the martial equivalent of mana points. They're an additional resource that you can use to empower various abilities. Again, you don't start with a lot, only 1 at first level and 6 at 10th level for a fighter. However, you always regain your maximum capacity at the end of combat, and classes that use them will also have unique ways of regaining them during combat. For example, a fighter can regain 1 stamina whenever they use one of their maneuvers, or a barbarian can regenerate a stamina whenever they score a heavy or brutal hit. This does bring an increased amount of management, which is another concern of mine, but we'll discuss that after we talk about another thing to manage, grit. Grit points are another point that you have to go along with your action points, mana points, and stamina points. You always have an amount of grit points equal to 2 plus your charisma modifier. Yes, if your charisma is negative, you can reduce the amount of grit points that you have. Grit is essentially representative of your force of will or your resolve and has 2 main uses. When you take damage from an attack, you can spend a grit point to reduce the damage by 1. Or, whenever a creature that you can see or hear is making a save, you can spend 1 grit point as a reaction to grant that character advantage on the save. I think the idea behind grit is fine, but just not in this current iteration. I like what it stands for, it's cool and it's flavorful, but I'm not so sure that it should exist as a game-wide mechanic. What I mean by that is that I can see it belonging to a certain class like fighters or commanders, but not everyone, and not equally either. It feels more class-specific to me, and even then I would probably do away with grit as a defined term. Allow the damage reduction ability to be something that a barbarian can do with a stamina point, or even just as a once per turn combat effect. Give bards the ability to grant advantage on saves, but again, dissociate it from the grit term. So finally, let's talk about all that management. For all the cool things that DC20 has going for it, which, don't get me wrong, is a lot, there's also a fairly reasonable amount of things to keep track of and manage, and some things that will constantly be going up and down. Action points, stamina points, mana points, grit points, it's just a lot of points, and that's before you even talk about features and talents and maneuvers and spells. There really is a lot going on. Now, to be clear, I truly do not believe that there is an overwhelming amount of things going on, and I think that it is, by and large, quite intuitive to learn and remember. But that doesn't mean that it can't be better, right? This is an alpha after all, and it is looking for active feedback. Like I explained before, maneuvers feel simple and intuitive. Techniques are a lot more involved, but again, you only have access to so few, so it's not really that bad. But stamina can constantly be fluctuating up and down throughout an encounter, which can be annoying to track, but especially complicated to track if you aren't using digital tools. This is kind of the same thing that I mentioned with regard to hope in Daggerheart. The constant fluctuation of the resource makes it so you spend so much time focusing on whether or not you remember to add it back, then you're just not focusing on what's going on. Grid points, like I mentioned, I think can just be done away with entirely. The concept can be folded into specific class or subclass features or even talents. I like the idea of it. I like that it helps give value to charisma as an ability, but I think it adds a level of complexity and additional management to the game that isn't justified by the benefit that it provides. One thing I really want to stress is that things inherently sound much more complicated than they really are when you just hear someone explain it in a 20-minute video. It's just a lot of words and you don't have a lot of reference points to tie it all back to. I don't think that explaining the ins and outs of combat in DC20 is any more complicated than explaining the same thing in 5e. The difference is that most of us already just have a strong working knowledge of 5e, so it feels easier. I'm not trying to say that DC20 is or isn't perfect, it's an alpha with over a year of development left on the game before it actually comes out, and I have full faith that most, if not all, of the quality of life issues will be ironed out by then. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video, don't forget to subscribe to help me reach 10K by September, but otherwise, take care.